Do rent caps actually work? Not if you like them or whether you don't like them, but objectively, we're going to run through, do they actually work? Because a think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, has researched this exact question and written this beautiful 17-page report running through the actual evidence that I'm going to be covering through with you now. Because although rent controls don't currently exist in the UK, they might in the future. It's actually something the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has been drumming on about for years now.
I'll fight the government to get controls over rent in London. I want to do a similar sort of rental controls other cities have. Berlin, capitalist city in a capitalist country, form of rent control. New York has a form of rent control. I think we need a mayor fighting for rent control in London.
Now, luckily, Sadiq Khan doesn't have the authority to impose rent controls in London, luckily. However, right now, the Renters' Rights Reform Bill is on every landlord's mind as a potential baby step towards rent controls. And as you can see, it's still got quite a journey before it gets to royal assent and is passed into law. But currently the bill itself, which is a whopping 226 pages long, but the two specific sections of concern are bits that seem to hint towards those first baby steps towards rent controls. They are, firstly, the statutory procedure for rent increases. That's section 7. That section basically outlines a statutory process us landlords must follow when increasing rents. While it allows for rent increases, tenants are given the right to challenge the amount of any increase through tribunals, which can then determine whether that new rent you're proposing is reasonable or not. And then the second section is challenging rent increases, section 8. So once us landlord has followed the procedure to increase rents, this is then the procedure tenants would follow. So they are given the right to challenge proposed rent increases, and tribunals can set a lower rent if the proposed rent is higher than what is deemed reasonable in the open market. This gives tenants some protection against unreasonable rent hikes. So as I read section 7 and 8 of the Renters' Rights Bill, I think the intentions of it are all very reasonable, because as I interpret it, it basically means if I know my tenant likes living in my property, for instance, and I know they don't want to go through the inconvenience of moving, I've in theory got leverage over them to increase the rent, maybe higher than even market value, and the tenant might pay it, not because it's fair, but because I've got leverage. They don't want to move. And in this situation, of course, that's me being an unfair landlord, and there should be ways for the tenant to challenge that. I think we'd all agree. But I think where landlords are getting worried this could escalate badly to is around the notion of someone else being able to decide what they rent their property for, which I also understand. If it's my house, then surely I should decide what it rents for. If I set the rent too high, then it just won't rent in theory. Instead, if a tenant challenges the rent, determination of rent is made by tribunal, and they decide how the open market rent is determined, which, to be honest, also doesn't sound like how a free open market should really work. Surely it shouldn't be a landlord or a tribunal deciding what something costs, but the market itself by what people choose to pay. What do you think? Anyway, let's get back to rent controls. Do they actually work? And I want to get back to that report from the Institute of Economic Affairs, because the summary to that report makes it pretty clear that although the majority of studies suggest rent controls lead to lower rent in controlled housing and higher home ownership, they also result in reduced supply of rental housing, reduced construction, reduced housing quality, reduced mobility, increased misallocation of housing, and increased rents in housing not subject to rent control. And concludes with, policymakers should conduct a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis before introducing rent controls. So is the medicine here worth the side effects? Comment below what you think, because it's ultimately what you think that matters most on this topic. But let's dive into the detail of this report. The report reviewed 206 studies on rent control effects between 1967 and 2024. And although the intention by governments was always to ensure tenants face reasonable, not unreasonable rental costs, almost all the 206 studies concluded it had also created unintended negative consequences. Probably worth pausing this video and just looking at these tables. The left table includes a breakdown of all the studies, whereas the right table just includes published studies which are generally considered more accurate because they've been published and peer-reviewed. You can see, for instance, out of 42 published studies on controlled rents, 37 found a negative effect, 4 found no effect, and only 1 study found a positive effect. Out of 10 studies that look at the impact of supply of property due to rent controls, 9 found a negative effect, 1 found no effect, and no study found any positive effects. Or if we skip to the bottom, out of 12 studies that look at the impact of uncontrolled rents, 1 finds a negative impact, 1 finds no impact, and 10 find a positive impact as a result of no rent controls whatsoever. The list goes on, and here's the total list so you can pause and read through all of those different points, because it just comes across so conclusively that rent controls on the whole just don't work. Yes, rent controls can temporarily alleviate affordability issues for certain tenants. It worked really well during the war in New York, but they then often generate longer-term market distortions, such as reduced housing supply, worsened quality of accommodation. It's short-term thinking, the same short-term thinking at the short-term actions we're sick of the government making constantly. So what's the solution? I personally think we should be promoting a free market. So promoting controlling rents by increasing supply. What do you think? What ideas do you have? What have I missed? I'll see you in the next video up here.